I was standing in front of hundreds of people at our industry awards when my mentor took the stage and laughed about me. He told the crowd I was just his assistant, not the strategist behind our biggest campaigns. The room filled with applause, but they were clapping for a lie. What no one knew was that I already had every document, every email, and every contract that proved what he'd done. I just needed him to keep talking, because by the end of the night, his career would be over. The ballroom glowed under crystal chandeliers, packed with executives, sponsors, and cameras. The tables shimmered with silver cutlery and champagne, but I barely noticed. My mentor Victor was being celebrated for his lifetime of innovation. I sat just a few tables away, wearing the same polite smile I'd worn through every lie he told. His words still echoed in my mind from earlier that week, the ones that revealed just how far he'd go to protect his image. Tonight, everyone would see the truth, even if they didn't realize it yet. Victor's laughter carried through the hall as his name was announced. He stood, adjusted his suit, and walked up to the stage like a man who believed he owned the room. Applause followed him, the kind of applause I used to help him earn. The award in his hand sparkled under the lights, a symbol of recognition built on stolen work. I sat motionless, my expression calm, though every heartbeat reminded me why I had come. He believed he was untouchable, but I had learned that even the loudest voices can crumble in silence. As he began his speech, the room quieted. His tone was warm and confident, the same tone he used when claiming my ideas as his own. He thanked the organization, then shifted toward humor. A quick jab aimed my way drew laughter from the crowd. He called me his assistant, pretending it was a light-hearted remark, and I watched as people laughed without realizing they were clapping for deception. I took a slow breath, reminding myself not to react. Anger wouldn't expose him, evidence would, and I had all the proof I needed. I glanced at my phone, resting on the table beside my glass of water. A single notification blinked across the screen from Tessa, my operations lead. The message was short but enough to steady my nerves. The last missing file had been found. Every forged signature, every altered timestamp, every contract Victor manipulated was now secured. I kept my focus on the stage as the applause grew louder again. He had no idea his performance was being watched for something far more important than entertainment. His downfall was already set in motion. My calm expression made a few people glance at me with quiet curiosity. They expected embarrassment or anger, but I gave them nothing. I had spent too long letting Victor shape how others saw me. That ended tonight. He stood there enjoying his spotlight, repeating his favorite line about leading the industry forward. I almost laughed at how predictable he was. Every word sounded like something he'd practiced in the mirror. Every smile seemed rehearsed. Yet behind the charm was a man terrified of being found out, and I planned to make sure he was. The audience didn't know the long story behind that stage. Years of mentorship that had slowly turned into control. He'd started as a guide, helping me rise through the company. Then he began taking credit for my ideas, claiming leadership while I did the work. I had convinced myself it was temporary, that recognition would come. It didn't. Every award, every speech, every promotion went to him, while I stayed behind the curtain building his empire. But I wasn't that silent partner anymore. Tonight was my quiet protest, and my final act of patience. As the host thanked him, Victor raised his glass toward me. The gesture looked like a sign of respect, but I knew it was mockery. He'd always used subtle gestures like that to remind me of my place. But this time, I didn't feel small. I looked at him and saw someone who'd built a tower of lies so high that one document could make it collapse. My fingers brushed against the sealed envelope in my purse. Inside it lay the evidence of every stolen idea he'd ever claimed as his own. Across the room, Nora, my lawyer, sat quietly near the back. She'd insisted on being here, just in case things escalated. Her presence was a reminder that this wasn't revenge, it was justice. She had helped me organize months of evidence into a clean, undeniable case. I didn't need confrontation or shouting. I only needed truth. When the time came, those papers would speak for themselves. For now, I sat through the applause, through the laughter, through his lies, because sometimes silence is the most powerful statement a person can make. Tessa sat 2 tables away, watching me with a calm expression. She looked like any other attendee enjoying the night, but her phone held the last piece of proof. The cloud records, transaction logs, and draft histories all showed his edits in detail. Every keystroke, every timestamp pointed back to him. We had rehearsed our timing carefully. He would make his joke, enjoy his attention, and then the spotlight would shift. Not because I'd interrupt, but because the truth would arrive at the board's desk before dessert was even served. The room sparkled with camera flashes as the photographers circled the tables. The entire event was being streamed live to industry media pages. That detail mattered more than Victor realized. Every arrogant smirk and every false statement would be captured on record. The board couldn't ignore what they saw or heard. For months, he'd crafted this image of a flawless visionary. But tonight, that illusion was being recorded for the last time. I wanted everyone watching from home to see the man behind the award, the man about to lose everything. Victor ended his speech with a sentimental story about teamwork. He mentioned my name just once, again referring to me as his assistant. It earned polite laughter, a joke that landed better than truth ever did. I didn't mind. I had already learned that real power isn't in applause, it's in proof. The more he spoke, the clearer his guilt became. His words didn't just mock me, they documented his lies. When he stepped off that stage, the applause would be for the last performance he'd ever give as a respected man. I could sense whispers forming at nearby tables. Some people noticed how quiet I was, expecting emotion, but they didn't realize restraint was the final step of preparation. Every time he smiled or gestured to the audience, I imagined the board reading those documents later tonight. I pictured their faces as they realized every innovation he presented was mine. That image steadied me. It reminded me why I couldn't confront him here. My silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Every second he stayed confident brought me closer to the end of his lie. I watched his reflection in the mirrored wall behind the stage. The arrogance looked almost rehearsed, practiced to perfection. He didn't see me anymore. In his mind, I had become invisible, reduced to a background figure. That mistake would cost him everything. People underestimate the quiet ones until silence becomes evidence. The documents Tessa had just secured would prove how deep his deceit went. I adjusted my napkin, pretending to focus on the dessert menu, while his downfall unfolded in real time, without him even realizing it. My phone vibrated again with one short message from Tessa. Final upload confirmed. Those 3 words were all I needed. The evidence packet had been submitted to Nora's legal portal and copied to the board's secure inbox. The timeline, the contracts, and the proof of backdated transfers were locked in. I set the phone face down beside my glass and smiled faintly. No confrontation, no scene, just truth, delivered quietly in the background of a celebration built on lies. It was almost poetic, but I wasn't here for poetry. I was here for closure. Applause thundered through the ballroom as Victor lifted his award and posed for photos. Reporters crowded the stage, flashes reflecting off his polished smile. To everyone else, he looked like a man at the peak of his success. To me, he looked like a man standing on the edge of a fall he couldn't see coming. I glanced around at the crowd that once admired him and wondered how quickly admiration turns into shock. The night wasn't over. His speech might have ended, but his story was only beginning to unravel. 2 days before the award ceremony, the office had felt unusually still. I was finalizing reports when Tessa appeared at my door, holding her tablet. Her expression gave away that she had found something important. She showed me a set of files stored in Victor's private cloud folder. They weren't just reports, they were contracts linked to our most successful campaign, but the listed author wasn't me. Every document had been renamed under Victor's shell company, disguised carefully, as if I would never think to look there. That was the moment everything started to shift. Tessa explained how she'd stumbled across the files while updating our archives. The new vendor listed was Vanguard Partners, supposedly brought in to manage our upcoming projects. The contact email traced back to a private address linked to Victor's nephew. It was too clean to be coincidence. He had created an entire paper trail to make it look like he was outsourcing my work. I stared at the screen in disbelief, realizing how long he must have been planning this. Each timestamp was recent, showing that the theft was still ongoing even that week. We opened one of the contracts, line by line. Every strategy note, client term, and proposal belonged to me. But the author tag bore Victor's initials. The language had been edited slightly, yet the structure was identical. My presentation decks had been stripped of my name and inserted into the new vendor's portfolio. The discovery stung, but it also gave me clarity. This wasn't about a single stolen idea. It was a complete transfer of ownership. He wanted to erase me quietly and replace me with his fabricated company. It wasn't incompetence anymore. It was fraud. I checked the metadata, while Tessa recorded screenshots and timestamps. Each file traced back to Victor's personal laptop. He had exported my work, altered details, then re-uploaded it to his new system. He even changed project dates to make it appear that his version existed first. The precision of it told me this wasn't the first time. My earlier doubts about his past awards now made sense. He'd done this before, but with less traceable evidence. I realized the only way to stop him was to expose everything publicly, not privately. That evening, I met with Nora, the lawyer I'd trusted for years. She studied the documents in silence, scrolling through the evidence with sharp focus. When she finished, she looked at me and said the proof was strong enough to end his career. But she warned me to stay quiet until the timing was right. Exposing him before the ceremony could backfire. If we lacked a public record, we needed witnesses, attention, and undeniable proof. She promised to prepare everything for the moment he handed me the opportunity himself on that stage. Before we move deeper into this story, if you're still watching, please like the video and subscribe for more stories like this one. It helps a lot and lets me know you're enjoying these moments of quiet justice. The next morning, I arrived at the office early. Victor was already there, pacing near the conference room window, rehearsing his speech. He smiled as if nothing was wrong, asking about the award presentation and calling it our shared victory. The hypocrisy barely registered anymore. I let him talk, nodding at the right moments, pretending to share his excitement. Meanwhile, Nora was finalizing the evidence timeline behind the scenes. She organized everything into folders, labeled by date and category, including altered contracts, bank transactions, and client correspondence. Each piece of truth was now documented. Tessa joined me later that morning, still uneasy about how calm I seemed. She'd known me long enough to understand. Silence meant planning. I reassured her that we would handle this through the system, not through confrontation. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about exposing dishonesty. I could sense her worry fading as we went through the checklist. Nora had sent every file we needed had been duplicated and stored securely on encrypted drives. Victor's confidence kept growing, unaware that his entire career was already collapsing behind his back. Timing would do the rest. By afternoon, Nora sent me a message confirming that the packet was almost ready. She included a list of board members and sponsors who would receive copies once Victor publicly claimed my work again. We planned for maximum impact with minimal noise. I reread the evidence repeatedly, feeling both satisfaction and sadness. For years I had admired him, believed he wanted to see me grow. Now I understood he had only wanted control. His mentorship had never been about guidance. It was about taking credit without effort. That realization closed whatever sympathy I still had. I spent the rest of that day going through my emails, finding patterns I had once ignored. He'd often compliment me right before a presentation, then step in front of the crowd and deliver my work as if it were his. It was calculated kindness, designed to keep me loyal. Seeing those emails now felt different. I archived them all into a folder titled Evidence, Communication. The more I gathered, the clearer the story became. He had used charm as a mask, and I had worn trust like blindfolds. Both would be removed at the awards. The night before the event, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by papers. Nora called to confirm the legal motion was drafted. If Victor denied everything later, we would still have digital proof and certified timestamps. She said the key was to stay composed, no matter what happened on stage. I agreed. The real power was in patience. While the city lights flickered outside my window, I realized this wasn't just about one man. It was about every person who had ever been silenced or overshadowed by someone louder. I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. The morning of the ceremony arrived. cold and clear. I dressed carefully, choosing a dark suit with a simple silver pin that once belonged to my grandmother. It reminded me to hold my ground with quiet dignity. Tessa met me outside the hotel where the event was taking place, holding her tablet and a backup drive. She didn't have to say anything. The determination in her eyes was enough. We walked inside together, passing photographers and press crews who had no idea that tonight's celebration would end very differently from how it was planned. The ballroom was already busy when we arrived. Staff hurried between tables, arranging centerpieces and testing microphones. The main stage displayed Victor's name on a massive screen surrounded by gold accents. It looked grand, almost theatrical, which felt appropriate for the performance he was about to give. I checked my phone one last time. Nora confirmed that everything was uploaded to the secure server and time-stamped. All that was left was for Victor to make his move. Once he did, every word and every laugh would become part of the evidence against him. I could feel a strange calm settling in as the event began. Victor mingled easily, shaking hands with sponsors and greeting the press. People gravitated toward him as if success itself had a scent. I noticed how naturally he played his role, the charming mentor, the visionary leader. I had seen that mask so many times. But tonight it no longer fooled me. When he reached our table, he gave a short nod, pretending nothing had ever gone wrong. I returned it with the same composure. He thought I was still his student. He was wrong. As dinner was served, conversation filled the air. I barely heard any of it. My attention stayed on Victor's table near the stage. Every few minutes, he rehearsed his speech cards, whispering the same lines under his breath. His assistants hovered close, smiling at his jokes, unaware that their loyalty would soon be tested. Tessa leaned over and quietly showed me her phone, confirming the live upload had synced with Nora's office. Every piece of evidence was now distributed and locked in. There was no undoing what was about to happen. When the main course was cleared, the host stepped up to the microphone. The sound system crackled as the announcer began introducing the award segment. Applause echoed through the room, followed by the kind of excited energy that fills formal events. Victor's name was mentioned among the honorees, and the crowd erupted in cheer. I joined in politely, hands together just long enough to blend in. The sound of clapping felt hollow in my ears. Everyone in that room thought they were celebrating achievement. In truth, they were watching the setup for exposure. Victor stood and adjusted his tie before walking to the stage. He carried himself like a man at the height of his success, every gesture deliberate and practiced. I remembered how he had once told me that confidence was the same as control. I had believed that for years. Now I understood that confidence without integrity is only arrogance. He reached the podium and began to speak, thanking the board and recounting his so-called journey. The crowd listened in admiration. They didn't know they were hearing the closing chapter of a long deception. He spoke about mentorship, leadership, and teamwork. He told stories about late nights and creative breakthroughs, conveniently leaving out who had done the actual work. The crowd nodded, eating up every word. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. This was the performance he had built his career around. He always knew how to say the right things to the right people, but words could only protect him until truth found its way into daylight. And tonight, truth had front-row seats. I kept my eyes on the stage, waiting for the slip. Then it happened. He looked in my direction, smiled, and turned me into part of his speech. With mock praise, he called me a brilliant assistant, adding that every great man needed someone to handle the small details. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed, capturing his grin and the audience's amusement. To them, it was harmless. To me, it was the signal. I didn't flinch, didn't look away. That one insult was all I needed for the board to see how he really viewed the people who built his empire. While the room applauded, I reached into my bag and tapped the notification on my phone. The sealed evidence packet was released automatically to the event committee's secure inbox. Nora had set it on a delay, waiting for my confirmation. It was done. As Victor enjoyed his applause, the truth was already in the inboxes of the very people who gave him that award. It was a silent handoff. No confrontation, no raised voices, just proof delivered while everyone smiled. The power of that quiet action felt stronger than any speech I could give. Victor continued talking about vision and perseverance, unaware that his speech had already been overshadowed by an email notification. Nora sent a short message confirming receipt. The evidence was now officially logged. I sat there among the applause, knowing the balance had shifted. He was still speaking, still basking in his false glory, but the walls around him were starting to crack. He just couldn't hear them yet. When he finished, the crowd rose to its feet in celebration. They thought they were clapping for a leader. They were clapping for his last lie. After the ceremony, guests mingled while servers replaced empty glasses. Victor moved through the crowd like a celebrity, shaking hands and accepting compliments. His award rested proudly on the table beside him. I stayed nearby, watching from a distance, answering polite questions from acquaintances who assumed I was honored to be part of his team. It was strange how easily people accepted appearances. Meanwhile, the evidence packet was already circulating through private messages among the board. The truth was moving quietly, much faster than any rumor or speech ever could. Nora texted me from the back of the room, saying the board chair had opened the evidence file. It was being reviewed right there. Mid-event. My heart beat evenly as I read her words. Nothing could stop what was in motion now. I stayed seated, sipping water while the energy around me remained festive. The quiet before exposure felt almost peaceful. Victor laughed with a group of sponsors, completely unaware that every word he'd spoken tonight was already turning against him. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Tessa approached me briefly, pretending to talk about project schedules for anyone listening nearby. She whispered that several executives had already seen the file and were asking questions. I nodded, hiding my relief. Everything was unfolding faster than expected. I kept my focus steady while the room's atmosphere began to shift. Laughter sounded thinner. Conversations slowed. Victor still smiled, but people started avoiding eye contact. The shift was small, but visible to those paying attention. It was the first crack in the wall of illusion he had built for years. Within minutes, I noticed board members leaving their tables to gather near the side doors. Their expressions looked polite, but strained. Victor noticed too, frowning slightly between smiles. He didn't understand what was happening yet. He thought they were preparing a surprise announcement or press moment. I watched him straighten his jacket nervously and glance at his phone. Then his face changed. He must have received the same message the board did. His confidence wavered for the first time all evening, replaced by the subtle realization that control was slipping away. The event host tapped the microphone, calling for attention. The room quieted as the awards committee chair stepped forward, holding a note card. They thanked everyone for attending, then mentioned that there had been a procedural review. The next words turned Victor's smile into stone. The committee had decided to pause the award pending verification of authorship claims. Whispers filled the air. Victor stood frozen, pretending to laugh it off. But the truth was already out. The room that once applauded him now stared in confusion, and his empire began to crumble. For a brief second, no one in the ballroom knew how to react. Some guests clapped awkwardly. Others whispered to each other, trying to understand what had just happened. Victor looked around for reassurance, but the faces that once adored him now avoided his eyes. The committee chair placed the microphone down and left the stage, followed by two board members carrying folders. I stayed seated, blending into the silence. I didn't need to move or speak. The truth was doing the work for me, and every second of his confusion was earned. Victor tried to recover with a smile, pretending that the announcement was routine. He joked with people at his table, but no one laughed this time. The energy had shifted. Sponsors glanced at their phones, reading emails quietly. His assistants whispered to each other with growing concern. I watched him glance toward the side of the room where Nora stood, her expression calm and unreadable. He recognized her face, and finally started to realize this wasn't an accident. He was standing inside the very trap he'd built for others, and there was no exit. The event staff tried to keep the atmosphere moving by playing background music, but the damage was done. Guests began excusing themselves politely, claiming early schedules or phone calls. Victor stayed frozen at his table, gripping his glass too tightly. I stood and walked toward the hallway, not to confront him but to give the board space to act. As I passed, I caught sight of his reflection in the mirrored wall. The confidence he'd worn all night was gone. In its place was disbelief, the first visible crack in the armor of a man exposed. Outside the ballroom, Nora was waiting with her phone pressed to her ear. She gave me a small nod, confirming the evidence had been verified by counsel. The committee was now contacting the sponsors to review contracts and author credits. It was happening faster than I expected. I asked if I should leave quietly, but she said it didn't matter anymore. Everything was documented, logged, and time-stamped. Whether I stayed or not, the outcome was sealed. I decided to walk back in and witness what truth looked like when it finally surfaced. When I returned, the room was quieter. Victor was speaking to two board members near the stage, gesturing wildly, his voice strained. The microphone was off, but I could tell from his posture he was trying to defend himself. The board members didn't respond. They just listened, their expressions unreadable. The audience pretended not to watch, but every eye was on him. People love success until it demands accountability. I sat down again, calm and still, watching as Victor tried to explain the unexplainable. His empire wasn't falling, it was evaporating in front of him. Within minutes, the board members left the room and returned with the event chair. The microphone turned back on, and the announcement was short. The award presentation would be postponed indefinitely while allegations of intellectual property theft were reviewed. Victor's name was omitted from the next list of honorees. The crowd began dispersing faster this time. No one wanted to be photographed beside a man under investigation. Victor stood motionless, trapped in the center of his own spotlight. I quietly gathered my things, knowing the public part of this story had just begun. Backstage, Victor tried to intercept me as I walked past. His face looked unfamiliar now, drawn and desperate. He started to speak, but I didn't stop or turn. There was nothing left to say. I had no reason to explain what he already knew. Nora was waiting near the exit, already speaking with the chair of the board's legal committee. The air outside the ballroom felt lighter. Cars passed on the street beyond the hotel windows, unaware that inside, an entire career had just collapsed under the weight of evidence and arrogance. By the time I reached home, my phone was overflowing with messages. Some from colleagues pretending surprise, others from sponsors asking for clarity. I didn't respond to any of them. Nora advised me to rest and wait until the morning. The news cycle would do the rest. I placed my phone face down on the kitchen counter and stared at the city lights through the window. For years, those same lights had represented ambition. Tonight, they looked different. I wasn't chasing recognition anymore. I was reclaiming something far more valuable. My name. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying every meeting, every project, every moment he had used my work to build his reputation. There was anger. Yes, but also relief. I had always doubted whether people like him ever faced consequences. Now I had proof that truth can catch up, even in boardrooms filled with polished smiles. The morning light crept across my desk, falling on the folder labeled Verified Evidence. For the first time in years, I felt free from the need to prove myself to anyone else. The evidence had already done that. At sunrise, I met Nora at her office. The board had called for an emergency session. Victor had requested to defend himself, but Nora said it was unlikely to change anything. She showed me a printed schedule listing, Intellectual Property Review Hearing. I signed a short statement confirming authorship of my campaigns. Nora assured me that everything was proceeding lawfully. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about correcting the record. She asked if I wanted to attend. I said yes. If I had learned anything from this, it was to never stay silent again. The hearing took place in the company's downtown headquarters. The boardroom was larger than I remembered, lined with glass walls and portraits of past executives. Victor sat at one end of the table, his posture rigid, a shadow of the confident man who once ruled this space. I sat across from him beside Nora, surrounded by documents stacked neatly in front of me. The board chair entered, calling the meeting to order. The quiet before the discussion wasn't awkward. It was final. Everyone in that room already knew how this story would end. Nora began the presentation with a timeline of projects. She projected my drafts and compared them to Victor's altered versions. Each slide showed matching text, identical strategies, and timestamps that proved who created what. The room stayed silent, except for the soft hum of the projector. When she displayed the metadata logs, Victor's name appeared repeatedly as the last editor. He leaned forward, scanning the screen, as if disbelief could rewrite the data. It couldn't. The truth was written in code, in digital fingerprints he could never erase. Every lie had a record, and it was showing. Next came the contracts, linking his shell company to client accounts. Nora traced the payment flow, from brand budgets to Vanguard partners, and finally to Victor's personal bank. The amounts weren't small. Every deposit matched a campaign I had led. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of the sponsors took a note, shaking their head slightly. Victor tried to interrupt, but the chair stopped him. The evidence was clear. He hadn't just taken credit, he had profited from it. The silence in the room now wasn't discomfort. It was disbelief that it had gone unnoticed for so long. When the presentation ended, the board asked Victor to respond. He started calmly, insisting it was a misunderstanding, but as he spoke, his voice grew shaky. He blamed technical errors, file mix-ups, even me, claiming I had given permission to use my work. Nora handed the board copies of emails that contradicted every claim. His excuses fell apart, one by one. I didn't interrupt or speak. Watching him struggle was enough. For years, he had enjoyed control over my silence. Now his own words were dismantling what little credibility he had left. The board members began asking questions about specific transactions. Victor answered some, avoided others, and grew visibly restless. One asked why his nephew's company shared an address with his personal accountant. He couldn't answer. Another questioned why contracts bore two different timestamps, but the same signature. He had no reply. Each question peeled back another layer of deception. I realized this wasn't just exposure, it was dissection. The lies that once seemed airtight were unraveling under simple scrutiny. Truth didn't need theatrics. It only needed time and attention to speak for itself. By mid-morning, the board chair announced a short recess. I stepped outside the glass doors with Nora and Tessa, who had joined remotely. Nora's tone remained steady as she updated us. The sponsors were already withdrawing their financial support from Victor's foundation. Without them, he'd lose every board seat he held. It was the professional equivalent of exile. Tessa asked what would happen next. Nora said regulators would review the evidence for potential fraud. The word fraud sounded heavy, but accurate. I had imagined this day many times, though reality felt strangely quiet and simple. Back in the room, Victor looked smaller somehow. His suit hung loosely, his expression hollow. The board reconvened quickly. They thanked Nora for her presentation and turned to internal votes. The process took less than 5 minutes. Each hand raised marked another door closing for him. I watched without emotion. When the chair announced that Victor was removed from all committees and barred from company representation, the decision felt inevitable. He nodded slowly, not in acceptance, but in disbelief. The mentor who once commanded rooms now couldn't even command his own defense. As the meeting ended, the board members filed out quietly, avoiding eye contact with him. Nora packed the documents neatly, sliding them into her briefcase. She told me it was over. I stayed seated for a moment longer, looking across the empty chairs. The room that once symbolized control now felt like closure. Victor stood near the far wall, staring at the projector screen that still displayed my name beside the campaign titles. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. For once, the credit matched the work. That truth was enough. Outside the conference building, the city buzzed as if nothing remarkable had happened. People walked to work, taxis honked, and life went on. I took a slow breath, feeling lighter than I had in years. Nora congratulated me for staying composed throughout the ordeal. She said not many people handle betrayal with such calm precision. I thanked her, but knew it wasn't calmness. It was exhaustion turned into focus. Years of silence had trained me for this moment. Justice didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it came in quiet signatures and undeniable facts. Later that afternoon, news outlets began reporting the story. Industry blogs ran headlines about corporate misconduct and leadership review underway. They didn't mention names yet, but everyone knew who it was. Messages flooded my inbox again, some apologetic, others curious. I ignored them all. Nora advised me to let the process unfold publicly before speaking. I agreed. Silence had served me well this far. Victor's reputation was unraveling in real time, and I didn't need to say a word. The evidence spoke louder than any statement I could make. That evening, Tessa stopped by my apartment with takeout. We ate quietly while checking updates online. The comments were already shifting in tone. People who once praised Victor now questioned his methods. Anonymous sources hinted at years of unethical behavior. Tessa asked how I felt seeing it all play out. I told her it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like balance. The truth had finally caught up to arrogance, and that was enough. She smiled and said the team at work was proud of how I'd handled everything. That mattered more than public applause. By the next morning, the company's internal newsletter confirmed Victor's resignation. Officially, he was stepping down for personal reasons. Unofficially, the board had forced him out. They released a statement emphasizing ethics and transparency moving forward. Nora forwarded me the memo, noting that my name appeared in several positive mentions about creative leadership. Reading it felt strange. I had spent so long being invisible that public acknowledgement felt unreal. I closed the email and stared out the window, realizing I didn't need validation anymore. Integrity had finally caught the spotlight. Over the next few days, the industry's reaction grew louder. Magazines withdrew his previous nominations, sponsors distanced themselves, and clients began requesting meetings with me directly. My calendar filled faster than I could manage. Nora reminded me to take things slowly and prioritize what mattered most. Tessa organized a new system for incoming contracts, this time with explicit authorship clauses to prevent future issues. Every part of our workflow changed. We had learned the cost of trust misplaced, and we were determined never to repeat it again. Growth came with scars, but it was growth nonetheless. Victor vanished from public view almost immediately. His social profiles were deleted. His name removed from upcoming conferences. A few mutual contacts mentioned he had left the city entirely. There was no satisfaction in that knowledge, only closure. People like him always assumed power was permanent, but credibility is fragile when built on lies. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I simply moved on, rebuilding what he had tried to claim. My team stood behind me, stronger than before, united by the shared understanding of what happens when truth is ignored for too long. A week later, Nora invited me to a small dinner with two major sponsors who wanted to discuss a new partnership. They had watched everything unfold and admired how I had handled it. Over dinner, they proposed creating a cross-brand innovation lab with me as director. I listened carefully, weighing the offer. It wasn't just a promotion. It was a new beginning under my name alone. I accepted on one condition: that every contract included fair credit and transparent ownership. They agreed without hesitation. For the first time, I felt the future belonged entirely to me. The next few weeks passed like a quiet rebuilding. My new position came with its own challenges, but this time, I wasn't working in anyone's shadow. I hired new staff and brought back a few trusted colleagues who had supported me through everything. Tessa managed operations with confidence, while Nora stayed on retainer to oversee every contract. I no longer felt the weight of second-guessing every move. Work became purposeful again, stripped of fear or politics. Each new campaign felt cleaner, freer, as though honesty itself had become the foundation of our progress. As the lab started operations, we were offered collaborations with international brands. The press called it a fresh start for the industry, a return to integrity after months of scandal. I didn't correct them. Letting the work speak for itself was enough. Every project carried my signature openly, something I once avoided to keep peace. Now ownership didn't feel like arrogance, it felt like fairness. The first major partnership launched within a month, and our results exceeded expectations. Clients noticed, investors returned, and the industry began viewing transparency not as risk but as strength. Meanwhile, Victor's absence became permanent. His former assistants reached out privately, apologizing for their role in covering his actions. Some sent supporting documents, confirming how he'd used their access to modify data and transfer files. I forwarded everything to Nora, who added it to the ongoing investigation. She told me it would likely end in legal penalties for him, though I no longer felt the need to follow every detail. My part was done. What mattered now was protecting what we built from ever being compromised again. The focus had shifted completely toward creation, not confrontation. By spring, the new lab had grown into a recognizable name. Our work environment became known for fairness and open collaboration. For the first time, people were motivated, not by fear of competition, but by pride in contribution. We had weekly meetings where credit was shared publicly, and small victories were celebrated together. It felt different from any company I had ever known. Every late night, every presentation, carried a sense of collective purpose. Sometimes, I caught myself wishing I had built this sooner, before ambition was tainted by manipulation. But better late than never. The press eventually printed the full story of Victor's downfall. A detailed article outlined the timeline of fraud, the stolen projects, and the final hearing that removed him from leadership. Reading it felt like watching an old chapter being sealed for good. There was no pride in it, just closure. People reached out with sympathy, but I didn't see myself as a victim anymore. I was a survivor of misplaced trust, and that was enough. I archived the article without rereading it. That part of my life no longer needed my attention or my energy. Nora continued monitoring the legal side of things. She updated me occasionally with progress reports, confirming that regulatory bodies were finalizing their findings. She said Victor's actions had set new compliance standards across several firms. Ironically, the same man who once avoided accountability had forced an entire industry to adopt it. That was the only lasting contribution he would ever make. I appreciated Nora's professionalism. She never glorified the outcome. She simply ensured justice stayed consistent. Her quiet dedication reminded me that real integrity doesn't shout. It stays steady even when no one's watching. One afternoon, Tessa brought me a message from an old client who wanted to return after months of silence. They said my calm handling of the scandal had restored their trust. It was strange how integrity, once seen as a weakness, had become our strongest asset. I thought about how different things felt now. No fear of being overshadowed, no need to prove my worth. Every meeting carried honesty instead of competition. I told Tessa to welcome them back under new terms. Clear credits, clear payments, clear ownership. This time, everything would be written, not assumed. The months rolled by, and our projects continued to grow. The lab became a hub for creative collaboration across cities. We hosted workshops for young strategists, teaching them how to protect their intellectual property. I shared my story quietly, not for attention, but as a warning about trust and complacency. Watching others learn from my mistakes gave the struggle meaning. I realized I wasn't just rebuilding a career. I was setting a standard. The same system that once silenced me now worked in my favor, and that reversal felt better than revenge ever could. One evening, after a long day of meetings, I stayed behind to clean up my desk. The office lights reflected off the city skyline, reminding me of that night at the awards. It felt like years ago now. I thought about how far things had come, how something built on deceit could lead to something better when handled with patience. The contrast between then and now couldn't be clearer. Back then, applause had meant validation. Now, quiet progress meant peace. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly proud of my own work. Nora called later that week with an update. The investigation had officially closed. Victor had been fined heavily, banned from executive positions, and stripped of his credentials. She said his former clients were reaching out to other firms for help, some even contacting our lab. The cycle had turned completely. I thanked her and asked that no further updates be sent. I didn't want my present defined by his past. The conversation ended cordially. I placed the phone down and allowed myself a small smile. Justice had arrived quietly, just the way I wanted. With the past settled, I focused entirely on expansion. The lab took on 3 new hires and began testing projects with advanced analytics and design systems. Every milestone we achieved carried a sense of renewal. The team's excitement reminded me of my early days in the industry, before things became political. There was laughter during breaks, healthy debate in meetings, and respect in every interaction. It was everything I had once hoped mentorship would feel like. I realized that the environment Victor tried to suppress was exactly the one I was meant to build. At our quarterly review, Tessa presented performance data that surpassed all expectations. The numbers reflected not only growth but stability. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, the genuine kind I had never heard before. It wasn't for a single person, it was for all of us. That collective joy felt more rewarding than any award ceremony. I thought back to that night under the chandeliers and understood something simple: recognition means nothing without respect. What we built now wasn't built to impress, it was built to last, anchored in fairness rather than applause. A few months later, an invitation arrived from the same organization that once hosted the awards. They wanted me to attend the next ceremony as a guest of honor. The irony wasn't lost on me. I considered declining but then decided to accept. Closure doesn't always come from distance. Sometimes it comes from walking back into the room that once held your pain and realizing it no longer defines you. I informed Tessa, who smiled knowingly. She said it was time the industry saw who really belonged on that stage. I agreed quietly. The night of the event, I returned to that same ballroom. Everything looked familiar. The chandeliers, the tables, the stage, but the feeling had changed completely. I wasn't nervous this time. I wasn't invisible. People greeted me warmly, their tone different from before. There was genuine respect in their voices. I took a seat near the front, noticing how many new faces filled the crowd. The industry had moved forward, learning from its mistakes. The awards segment approached again, and I felt calm, not as a participant in someone else's success, but as the architect of my own. When the host took the stage, I noticed a moment of quiet recognition as my name was mentioned among contributors being honored for innovation. The applause that followed was polite, not frenzied, and that made it feel real. No exaggerated praise, no false smiles, just acknowledgement. I didn't crave more than that. The host spoke briefly about rebuilding integrity and leadership. Hearing those words felt like a quiet full circle moment. My story had shaped more than one career. It had shifted an entire industry's standard. That realization felt heavier than any trophy ever could. After the ceremony, several younger professionals approached me with questions. They wanted to know how I handled betrayal without letting anger destroy my work. I told them the truth, that anger doesn't disappear. It just needs direction. You turn it into purpose, structure, and consistency. They listened carefully, their eyes reflecting the same eagerness I once had. I realized then that my legacy wouldn't be a campaign or an award. It would be the lessons passed down quietly to people who might one day face their own version of the same betrayal. Later that evening, I stood by the balcony, overlooking the city lights, just as I had done a year before. The night air felt calmer, no longer heavy with tension. Tessa joined me with a glass of water, smiling at the crowd behind us. She said it felt like things had finally come full circle. I nodded, watching the lights stretch across the skyline. We talked about expanding the lab into new markets, bringing mentorship programs for students. It felt right to transform pain into something useful. That's how survival truly becomes strength. Before leaving, the event organizers stopped by to thank me for attending. She said my story had inspired their new code of ethics for creative credit. Hearing that made everything worth it. It proved that change, though slow, was possible. I shook her hand and wished her well, then gathered my things. As I walked toward the exit, the familiar sound of clinking glasses and soft laughter faded behind me. The room that once symbolized humiliation now represented resilience. I didn't need recognition anymore. I already had peace, and that was enough. Outside, the cool night air wrapped around me as I stepped onto the street. The city hummed with life, unaware of the quiet victory unfolding in one corner of its map. Cars passed, lights flickered, and for a brief moment, I paused under the glow of a street lamp. The contrast between that first night and this one couldn't have been clearer. I had entered that ballroom once, as someone's shadow. Tonight, I left it as my own light. No anger, no triumph, just peace, the kind that only truth and patience can bring. I rode home in silence, watching the city blur through the car window. My phone buzzed with new messages. Congratulations, partnership offers and invitations. I smiled. Not because of the attention, but because none of it defined me anymore. My worth was no longer tied to validation. I had learned that real success isn't about how loud the world claps for you, but how quietly you can rebuild when it doesn't. As the car pulled up to my building, I felt a calm certainty that whatever came next would be built entirely on my own terms. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The sun was streaming through the windows, casting warm light across the desks. Tessa was already there, organizing files for our upcoming projects. She greeted me with her usual smile and asked how the event went. I told her it went exactly as it needed to. She laughed softly, understanding what I meant without asking for details. We both turned to the board filled with new ideas. It wasn't about looking back anymore. The only direction that mattered now was forward. Later that day, Nora dropped by with signed copies of new partnership agreements. She congratulated us on expanding faster than projected. I thanked her and offered her coffee, but she said she had another meeting across town. Before leaving, she looked around the office and said it felt peaceful here, as if the place itself had healed from what happened. I smiled, knowing that was true. The same walls that once held exhaustion and doubt now held focus and hope. It was proof that spaces like people could recover when honesty returned. Over lunch, the team gathered to celebrate another milestone. We'd just landed a major client through referrals from the same board that once questioned me. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Tessa made a short toast, thanking everyone for believing in fair work. Laughter filled the room, light and unforced. No one was performing anymore. Everyone belonged. I watched them with quiet pride, realizing this was what I had wanted all along, a place where effort mattered more than ego. The sound of genuine laughter replaced the memory of fake applause, and that was healing enough. That evening, I stayed late again, finalizing reports for our investors. Outside, the skyline shimmered with color as the sun dipped below the horizon. The view from my office window mirrored my own life, steady, calm, and built on real foundations. I closed the last file and looked around the quiet workspace. The past had taught me everything I needed to know about ambition, trust, and boundaries. I was no longer chasing recognition. I was protecting integrity, and that made all the difference. Growth had finally replaced survival, and I was ready for whatever came next. As I locked up and walked out into the evening air, the street below buzzed with movement. I paused for a moment at the corner, remembering how fear once held me back. Now, that fear was gone, replaced by quiet certainty. I had faced deceit, isolation, and humiliation, yet I had turned them into lessons and purpose. The city lights ahead looked inviting, not intimidating. Every step forward now felt like freedom. I headed home, knowing the story that began with mockery had ended with strength. Truth had won, and it would stay that way. Months passed, and the rhythm of normal work life returned. My calendar filled with meetings, not about survival but growth. We were expanding into new cities and forming partnerships with universities. Students wanted internships to learn how integrity could coexist with success. That kind of curiosity made me proud. Each day brought new progress, yet I never forgot how fragile trust could be. Every contract, every collaboration carried lessons from the past. I no longer feared repeating mistakes because now every system I built was designed to keep truth at its core. One afternoon, a message arrived from an old journalist who had covered Victor's story. She wanted to write a follow-up about how I rebuilt after the scandal. I hesitated at first, not wanting to reopen old wounds, but she explained that it wasn't about him, it was about resilience. I agreed on the condition that the focus stayed on the importance of credit and transparency in creative work. The article was published a week later, titled "The Strategist Who Chose Integrity Over Power." Reading it reminded me how far the journey had come full circle. The article spread quickly online, gaining quiet traction among professionals. Emails poured in from people sharing similar experiences of having their work stolen or minimized. Many thanked me for speaking publicly about it. Their words touched me deeply. I realized my story had become more than personal. It had become symbolic of what many faced in silence. Nora called to say the response was overwhelmingly positive. For once, the headlines weren't about scandal, but about recovery and rebuilding. That shift in narrative felt like the true victory, one grounded in honesty, not spectacle. Soon after, I was invited to speak at a leadership seminar. It wasn't my usual comfort zone, but I accepted. Standing on that stage, I told the audience how easily ambition can blur ethics if left unchecked. I spoke about accountability, about giving credit where it's due, and about the quiet strength and fairness. The audience listened intently, not with awe, but with recognition. Many had seen similar power dynamics in their own careers. When I stepped off stage, the applause was polite yet sincere. It wasn't for drama, it was for truth, well spoken. After the event, a young strategist approached me, eyes bright with determination. She said my story had encouraged her to stand up for her work in her own company. That moment meant more than any award. Seeing courage ripple outward felt like purpose. I told her that standing up doesn't always mean fighting. Sometimes it means documenting, preparing, and waiting until facts speak for themselves. She nodded, understanding what patience can achieve. That quiet conversation stayed with me longer than the applause. It reminded me why telling the story mattered in the first place. Back at the office, Tessa organized a celebration marking the lab's one-year anniversary. The team decorated the workspace with photos from our projects and handwritten notes of gratitude. As I walked through the room reading those messages, I realized this was what real success looked like. People proud to work together, not compete against each other. We shared dinner and laughter. No speeches, no hierarchy, just shared pride. For years, I had chased external validation, but that night, surrounded by genuine joy, I understood that fulfillment comes quietly, without needing an audience. The following week, I received an invitation to join the board of a creative ethics foundation. They wanted me to help develop policies for protecting authorship in the industry. It felt like the final step in turning pain into purpose. I accepted, knowing it would allow me to shape systems that prevent stories like mine from repeating. Nora helped finalize the legal paperwork. Signing that document felt significant. I wasn't just rebuilding my name. I was contributing to an environment where fairness was no longer optional but expected. The full circle had finally closed. With each passing month, the lab grew stronger. We moved into a larger space downtown, complete with training rooms and client studios. The walls were lined with our projects, each credited properly to its creators. I made sure everyone who contributed was recognized equally. The culture we built became our greatest strength. Clients began noticing how stable and transparent our workflow was. For them, honesty became synonymous with quality. That shift in perception across the industry proved that integrity wasn't a weakness. It was the new competitive advantage. It was everything Victor never understood. Late one evening, I walked through the new office alone. The sound of distant traffic echoed softly through the windows. I paused by the display wall, showing our timeline from the lab's founding to the present. Each photo marked a milestone, projects, team moments, and client achievements. The last frame was blank, reserved for the future. I smiled at it, realizing that success doesn't need closure, it needs continuity. I didn't want the story to end here. The point was to keep creating, keep leading, and keep proving that integrity can thrive in any environment. Nora stopped by later that week with news from the foundation. They had approved funding for a mentorship program, supporting young women in leadership roles. They wanted me to oversee its development. It felt like the perfect continuation of everything we'd built. We sat in the conference room going over ideas while the team worked nearby. The energy in the room was calm but purposeful. I thought back to the version of myself who once stayed quiet out of fear. Now I was shaping a future where others wouldn't have to make that same choice. One afternoon, while sorting through archived folders, I came across an old project proposal, one of the first Victor had taken credit for. I hadn't seen it since the investigation. The file still carried my annotations, handwritten notes, and sketches. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the anger that once consumed me, but it passed quickly. I didn't need resentment anymore. The document that once symbolized betrayal now felt like proof of survival. I placed it back in the folder carefully. It didn't hurt to remember anymore. It only reminded me how much I'd grown. The foundation's first mentorship event arrived quickly. The room was filled with eager faces. each carrying their own story of struggle or ambition. I spoke about the difference between being talented and being seen, and how important it is to protect your own work. The questions that followed were thoughtful, full of hope. It was rewarding to see honesty being discussed openly as a skill, not just a virtue. When the event ended, one participant thanked me for turning a painful story into something that helped others, that more than anything, felt like healing. Over time, the mentorship program expanded beyond the city. Online workshops connected professionals from different countries, all united by one goal: creating without fear of theft or exploitation. Watching the network grow felt like watching light spread in a place that used to be dark. I knew it wasn't fixing everything, but it was progress. For years I had lived under someone else's shadow. Now that shadow had transformed into shelter for others. That thought brought peace. The story that began in betrayal was now teaching strength to people I might never even meet. One evening, I visited Nora's office to review the annual report for the lab. She handed me a printed copy, showing steady growth across every metric. She said our work had become a benchmark for ethical business. I laughed softly at the irony. What once felt like ruin had become a model for reform. Nora said she was proud of me, and I believed her. I thanked her for standing by me when I had nothing to offer except a folder of stolen ideas. Her quiet faith had changed everything. Sometimes justice needs patience, not noise. As the year drew to a close, the lab hosted a small gathering to celebrate our achievements. The entire team attended, along with clients and partners who had become friends. The evening was filled with easy laughter and quiet gratitude. There were no awards or speeches, only conversations about the future. I realized that success feels most real when it doesn't need to be announced. When the night ended, I stayed back for a moment, watching the lights dim and hearing the last echoes of laughter fade into calm. It was enough. A few days later, an unexpected email arrived from a familiar name, one of Victor's former assistants. She thanked me for handling everything with grace and said she'd learned more from my silence than from his leadership. Attached was a note Victor had written years ago, admitting his fear of being forgotten. Reading it, I felt an unexpected mix of sadness and closure. His legacy had been built on insecurity, not ambition. I deleted the email quietly, choosing not to respond. Some stories don't need revisiting. Their lessons are already written in memory. The holidays arrived soon after. The office closed for a short break, giving everyone time to rest. I stayed behind one evening, walking through the quiet halls. Outside, snow had begun to fall softly across the city. The view felt peaceful, almost like a final chapter closing itself. I thought about how every mistake, every loss, and every victory had brought me here. It wasn't luck, it was endurance. The kind that doesn't shout or demand attention, but keeps moving forward quietly. The kind that builds a life out of truth, rather than illusion. When the new year began, our first client meeting set a different tone entirely. The conversation centered not on profits or competition, but on ethics and collaboration. Times had changed, and so had the people leading those discussions. Seeing others embrace what once seemed impossible felt fulfilling. Tessa smiled across the table, recognizing the same shift. The values that once made us outsiders were now the new standard. I realized then that true influence isn't loud, it's lasting. It happens when others start living by the same principles you refuse to compromise. By spring, the mentorship network had grown to include hundreds of members. We began planning annual summits for creative professionals across industries. Invitations came from universities and corporate groups wanting to collaborate. I traveled often, speaking not about scandal but about structure and self-worth. The attention didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt useful. My story had become a tool for awareness, not entertainment. Every time someone approached to say they'd found courage through it, I knew the pain of the past had finally served its purpose. It had turned into something meaningful. At one conference, I was asked how I managed to forgive someone who never apologized. The question stayed with me. On the flight home, I realized forgiveness isn't about the other person, it's about reclaiming your peace. I didn't need an apology to move forward. The truth itself was enough. Victor's silence no longer mattered. What mattered was how I used that space he left behind. I had filled it with progress, purpose, and people who believed in honesty. That was the kind of closure that no court or apology could ever provide. As the months passed, the lab reached milestones that once felt unreachable. Our revenue doubled, our reputation stabilized, and our partnerships expanded globally. Yet what meant most wasn't the growth. It was the stability. Every day felt predictable in the best way. No deception, no hidden motives, no performance. Just real work done by real people. I found peace in that rhythm. Sometimes I stayed late just to listen to the quiet hum of computers, a reminder that honesty doesn't need noise to thrive. It survives in consistency, and we had built plenty of that. One afternoon, Tessa handed me a framed photo she had printed, a picture from our first day at the new office. Beneath it, she'd written, "Built on truth." It was simple, but it said everything. I hung it in the main hallway, where everyone could see it every morning. That small reminder meant more than any plaque or trophy. It wasn't a decoration, it was a declaration. We had come full circle, from silence to voice, from manipulation to fairness, and every face in that office was living proof that change could be built, not inherited. As summer arrived, I took a short break for the first time in years. I rented a cabin near the coast, far from the city's noise. Each morning, I watched the sun rise over the water with a notebook in hand. I wrote about everything that had happened, not for publication, but for clarity. Writing it down felt like placing heavy stones on the shore and walking away lighter. The ocean didn't judge or applaud. It simply reflected. It reminded me that truth, like water, always finds its way back to the surface. When I returned, the office greeted me with quiet excitement. The team had finished 2 major projects while I was gone, both successful and well received. I realized I wasn't needed for everything anymore, and that was a good thing. Leadership wasn't about control, it was about trust. Watching them thrive without my constant direction made me proud. The company had grown beyond me. That independence was the final sign that we had truly built something sustainable. It was no longer about recovering from the past, it was about defining the future. That evening, as I locked up, I passed the wall where we displayed our milestones. The newest addition was a plaque from the Ethics Foundation, honoring our contributions to fair creative practices. I stood there for a moment, thinking about the long road from that ballroom to this quiet hallway. The journey had begun with humiliation, but it ended with integrity restored. Every lie, every stolen credit, had been replaced by genuine achievement. I turned off the lights, feeling calm certainty in my chest. The truth had prevailed, and it was staying that way. The next few months brought a calm I hadn't known in years. The office moved smoothly, projects flowed without tension, and each day felt predictable in a peaceful way. I began mentoring a few new recruits personally, guiding them through lessons I had learned the hard way, watching them grow with honesty as their foundation filled me with quiet pride. They didn't need to know every detail of what I'd endured. All they needed to see was what perseverance looked like when truth becomes habit, not a fight. That was the real victory. One afternoon, Nora stopped by with a surprise, an envelope containing the final closure documents from the regulatory board. She said all remaining investigations tied to Victor's misconduct had officially ended. I opened the letter slowly, scanning the brief statement confirming full resolution. No appeals, no delays, just an official end. Nora smiled and said it was rare for justice to wrap up so cleanly. I thanked her and folded the letter carefully, placing it in my desk drawer. The past no longer needed to linger. It had been acknowledged, recorded, and finally put to rest. That evening, as the office emptied, I stood by the window watching the streetlights blink to life. It struck me how different this moment felt compared to the night it all began. There was no bitterness left, no trace of anxiety about what people thought. I had earned peace through persistence, not luck. The glow from the street reflected faintly on the window pane, and I caught my reflection smiling back. It wasn't triumph, it was release. The kind that comes when you finally stop carrying the weight of injustice and start living beyond it. Over time, Victor's name faded completely from conversations. New leaders took his place, and the industry moved forward. The silence surrounding him wasn't cruel. It was natural. He had become irrelevant to the world he once tried to dominate. Sometimes people asked if I ever wondered what happened to him. I didn't. Some endings don't need witnesses, they only need closure. My story wasn't tied to his anymore. The shadow he cast had long since dissolved, replaced by the steady light of progress and truth. That, I realized, was the most fitting consequence of all. Our company newsletter began featuring short stories from employees about what integrity meant to them. Reading those submissions was more rewarding than any external recognition. People shared experiences about learning to speak up, to give credit, to choose fairness over comfort. Their words reminded me that leadership wasn't about guiding through authority but by example. I didn't need to control outcomes anymore. I just needed to nurture honesty. Seeing that culture grow made every struggle worth it. I finally understood that influence built on truth has no expiration date. It endures quietly, generation after generation. The following week, we hosted our second anniversary event for the lab. It wasn't extravagant, just an evening gathering with music, food, and laughter. Everyone shared small stories about what working here meant to them. When it was my turn, I kept it brief. I thanked them for believing in integrity as more than an idea. I told them the future wouldn't always be easy, but as long as we stayed transparent, we'd never have to rebuild from ruin again. The applause that followed wasn't loud, it was warm. That kind of sincerity is rare and precious. Later that night, I found myself walking along the same street where everything had once felt impossible. The air was cool, and the city glowed softly under passing headlights. I thought about how much had changed since that first night of humiliation. Back then, I'd been scared to breathe too loudly. Now, I walked freely, unafraid of attention or judgment. Growth isn't dramatic, it's steady, like a heartbeat. It's built quietly, one honest decision at a time. Each step I took felt lighter, carrying only lessons, not regrets. The path forward finally felt entirely mine. One weekend, Tessa invited the team for a retreat outside the city. We rented a cabin surrounded by hills and open sky. There was no agenda, no presentations, only rest. Around the campfire, the team talked about their dreams, projects, travels, families. When it was my turn, I told them my dream was simple, to keep this integrity alive, even when I'm no longer here to remind them. They nodded, understanding what I meant, without further explanation. That night, under a quiet sky, I felt the kind of contentment that comes only when peace is earned. A few weeks later, Nora called to inform me that the foundation wanted to name a scholarship after me, dedicated to ethical leadership. I was surprised, even hesitant. But she insisted it wasn't about recognition. It was about legacy. I accepted, not out of pride, but gratitude. Knowing future students would learn about fairness before facing the world's compromises gave meaning to everything. It wasn't about keeping my name alive. It was about keeping integrity alive through them. That thought brought a calm smile, one filled with appreciation rather than ambition. As time passed, the scholarship gained popularity. Students wrote heartfelt letters about how it inspired them to stay honest even when shortcuts seemed easier. Reading those letters became a quiet ritual. Each story reminded me that truth wasn't fragile, it was contagious. It spread through people who valued decency more than approval. One letter stood out from a student who wrote, "You showed that silence can speak louder than anger." That single sentence felt like a mirror of my journey. It captured everything I'd hoped to prove without needing to explain a single word. That summer, we were invited to an international summit on corporate ethics. Tessa led the main presentation, while I observed from the front row. Watching her speak confidently about systems I once fought to defend made me proud. She didn't need my presence to validate her success, and that was the point. True leadership means creating successors, not followers. The audience applauded as she finished, and I realized she represented everything the company had become: capable, transparent, and fearless. It was proof that fairness doesn't end with one story. It evolves through everyone who carries it forward. After the summit, I took a few days off and visited a quiet seaside town. The rhythm of waves against the shore reminded me of how far the story had come. The sound wasn't dramatic, just steady and endless, like time healing old wounds. I walked along the sand at dusk, leaving faint footprints that the tide erased moments later. It made me think about how nothing truly disappears. It just transforms. My past hadn't vanished. It had become part of a greater truth, one that didn't hurt anymore. That realization felt like real freedom. While sitting on a bench overlooking the water, I received a message from Nora. She wrote simply, "Full circle." Attached was a news update. The foundation had expanded internationally, adopting our policies as a standard for creative rights. I laughed softly at the irony. What began as one man's deceit had ended by shaping global ethics. I turned the phone off and slipped it into my pocket. Some victories don't need celebration, they need reflection. I closed my eyes and let the sound of the ocean carry the final chapter quietly into peace. Returning to the city, I found the office busier than ever. New projects lined the whiteboard, and the energy was contagious. I no longer felt the urge to oversee every detail. The lab had grown beyond me, sustained by the same integrity that built it. I spent more time mentoring, guiding others through moments of uncertainty. Whenever someone doubted themselves, I reminded them that honesty always wins, even if it takes time. Seeing them nod with understanding felt better than any recognition. It was proof that truth wasn't just my story, it had become our culture. One afternoon, while organizing some old files, I found the original award invitation from that night years ago. The paper was slightly faded, but still crisp. I turned it over in my hands, thinking about how differently life had unfolded. The event that once humiliated me had also set everything else in motion. Without that moment, I might never have found my voice. I placed the invitation back in the drawer, not as a painful reminder, but as a symbol of transformation. Sometimes, the worst moments are simply beginnings disguised as endings. Later that week, we hosted a new orientation for employees. During my opening remarks, I told them about the importance of accountability, not as a rule, but as a choice. I explained how truth simplifies everything. It eliminates fear, reduces conflict, and builds trust faster than talent ever could. They listened quietly, understanding that these weren't just corporate values, but lived experiences. As the session ended, I saw in their faces the same fire I once had, only now fueled by clarity instead of ambition. The future felt safe in their hands. That night, I walked past the office glass doors and looked back one last time before heading home. The lights inside glowed softly, reflecting years of work and redemption. I thought about every lesson this journey had taught me, that integrity doesn't demand recognition, that silence can hold more strength than shouting, and that truth, once released, never loses power. The city outside continued its rhythm, indifferent yet alive. I smiled, feeling grateful that I had found peace not by winning over others, but by being honest with myself. That was enough. Weeks later, the foundation held its annual gala. They presented the first scholarship in my name to a young designer whose project focused on fair credit for creative teams. Watching her accept it filled me with quiet pride. She didn't know me personally, but she thanked the principles the scholarship stood for. In that moment, I realized my story had officially outgrown me. It was no longer about redemption. It was about continuity. The world had taken the lesson and carried it forward, ensuring that truth remained stronger than ego. When the event ended, I stepped outside and looked at the night sky. The stars shimmered faintly above the city skyline, reminding me of how every story, no matter how painful, eventually finds light. The journey had been long, filled with lessons carved from betrayal, patience, and resolve. I thought about Victor once more. Not with hatred, but with closure. He had been the storm, but I had become the calm that followed. Life, I realized, doesn't punish or reward, it reveals. And what it revealed in me was strength I never knew I had. In the following months, I reduced my workload to focus on mentorship and community initiatives. Tessa took on more leadership, and the transition felt natural. The company thrived without my constant involvement, which was the truest sign of success. My role evolved into guidance, not governance. It felt good to know I could step back without fear. Everything we built had its own momentum now. The machine no longer needed to be pushed. It simply moved forward, driven by honesty. Watching that unfold was more fulfilling than any personal accolade ever could be. As time went on, I started spending weekends in quieter places, gardens, libraries, small coastal towns. I no longer chased deadlines or recognition. Life had shifted into something slower but richer. I met new people outside my industry who knew nothing of my story, and that anonymity felt refreshing. For the first time in years, I was simply myself, not a symbol or survivor. Freedom, I realized, wasn't found in erasing the past, but in making peace with it. Every scar I carried had turned into proof that truth outlasts everything, even ambition. One morning, Tessa called to tell me our company had been named among the most ethical workplaces of the year. The announcement didn't bring tears or excitement, only quiet gratitude. It was never about awards. It was about the path we took to get here. I congratulated her and asked her to share the news with the team. She laughed and said they already knew. Hearing their laughter in the background warmed me more than any ceremony ever could. Recognition mattered less now. What mattered was that decency had become our standard, not our exception. As I looked around my home office that evening, I saw the framed photos, the certificates, and the memories that told the entire journey. Yet my favorite thing in that room wasn't an award or a plaque. It was a small handwritten note from Tessa that read, "Thank you for showing us what truth looks like in action." I smiled at the simplicity of it. All the documents, all the achievements, and all the victories could fade someday, but that one sentence captured the entire purpose of everything I had done. It was enough. Years later, when I thought back to the night it all began, I no longer saw the humiliation, I saw the turning point. The laughter that once felt like defeat had become the echo that started a new story. Every betrayal, every challenge had pushed me toward the life I was meant to build. Looking back, I didn't wish for an easier path. I was grateful for the harder one. It taught me patience, humility, and the quiet strength that no applause can ever give. The truth had freed me, and it stayed by my side. Now, as I look at where life has settled, I feel no bitterness, no lingering anger, only peace. The story that began with a public insult ended with a lifetime of quiet redemption. My mentor once mocked me on stage, claiming I was only an assistant. He was wrong. I became the leader of an empire, built on truth, not illusion. His downfall was noise. My rise was silence. And in that silence, I found everything I'd been searching for: respect, freedom, and a legacy that no one could ever take away again.